She was trying not to make a sound. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her face, not her voice, but the terrible discipline of a woman folding her own grief into silence so it wouldn't leak out where anyone could see it. And Nico Marchetti, a man who had built an empire on reading what people tried to hide, stopped chewing his food, set down his fork, and listened to a stranger cry behind a swinging kitchen door like it was the most important sound in the world. He hadn't meant to be here. That was the truth of it, though later he would tell himself a dozen more convenient versions. His driver had taken a wrong exit off the interstate to avoid a police checkpoint that wasn't even looking for them, and the black SUV had rolled through 30 miles of Ohio farmland before Nico, restless and hungry and sick of the smell of leather and gun oil, had told Sal to pull into the first place with a lit sign. The sign said, Evergreen Diner. Half its neon burned out, so it read, Evergreen, like a promise nobody had bothered to finish. Inside it smelled like old coffee and fryer grease and something warmer underneath, something like bread. Nico sat in a booth by the window, out of habit facing the door, and ordered the meatloaf because it was the kind of thing a man like him was never supposed to eat in public, and some stubborn part of him wanted it anyway. The waitress who took his order had a name tag that said Wren, handwriting shaky like she'd redone the letters herself after the plastic one cracked. She was quiet, economical with her words, the kind of quiet that Nico recognized immediately because he practiced it himself. Not shyness, but control. A woman keeping something locked down, tight enough that it never showed on her face, while she poured his coffee. He watched her hands, steady, no tremor, but her eyes didn't quite land on him, the way people's eyes don't quite land on anything when they're holding themselves together by a thread. 20 minutes later, the thread snapped somewhere behind the kitchen door, and he heard her. It wasn't loud. That was what unsettled him most. He had heard men beg before they died, heard mothers scream in doorways when his men came to collect debts the hard way, and he had trained himself, brutally, over 15 years, to feel nothing at the sound of a person breaking. But this quiet, swallowed, disciplined crying, a woman trying so hard not to be heard that her sobs came out as nothing more than ragged little breaths, this got under his skin in a way that no scream ever had. He should have looked away. He should have finished his coffee, paid in cash, and let his driver take him back to the highway and the life waiting for him 3 states over, where a rival family was testing the edges of his territory, and his cousin was demanding blood for an insult that hadn't even happened yet. That was the version of tonight that made sense. Instead, Nico Marchetti, 34 years old, the youngest boss the Marchetti organization had ever crowned, a man whose silence could empty a room faster than a gun, got up from his booth, walked to the counter, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that only she would hear it, when she came back through that door, "Whoever did that to you, tell me their name." Before we go any further into how far that single sentence would end up reaching, into secrets neither of them wanted looked at, into men who had been hunting Wren for 11 months, into a truth about Nico's own family that would break something he thought could never break. If you're the kind of person who loves stories built on power, obsession, and the particular danger of 2 people who should never have looked at each other twice, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists for. Hit that like button, subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories, and tell me in the comments, if a stranger in a diner asked you that question, would you answer him? Wren Ashford did not answer him. Not that night. She came back through the kitchen door, with her face scrubbed pink and her eyes carefully blank. The practiced blankness of someone who had done this before, cried in private, then walked back out into public like nothing had happened, because the world did not stop for a waitress's bad night. She saw the man from booth 6 standing at her counter instead of sitting where she'd left him, and something in her chest went very still and very cold, the way a rabbit goes still when it hears something move in the grass. She knew what he was. Not his name, not yet, but she knew the shape of him, the tailored dark coat that cost more than her month's wages, the way the diner's other 3 customers had gone quiet and small the moment he walked in without him doing anything at all, the 2 men who'd stayed by the SUV outside instead of coming in to eat, standing with their hands folded in front of them like soldiers. She had spent 11 months learning to read exactly this kind of danger, because reading it wrong, even once, meant she might not wake up the next morning. So she looked at Nico Marchetti and did what she had trained herself to do with every dangerous man since she'd become someone else. She smiled, small and professional, and said, "Can I get you anything else?" "You can get me the truth," Nico said. "Someone made you cry in there. I want to know who." "That's not really diner conversation," Ren said, and reached for the coffee pot like her hands weren't shaking. He let her walk away. That, too, surprised him. He wasn't a man who let things walk away from him. Not information, not disrespect, not people who owed him answers. But something about the flat refusal in her voice told him that pushing would only make her run. And Nico Marchetti had learned long ago that the things worth having were rarely the things you could take by force. So he sat back down in his booth, finished his meatloaf slowly, and watched her work the rest of her shift with an attention that felt less like observation and more like a held breath. She was good at her job, efficient, warm with the regulars, in a way that felt genuine even under the exhaustion. Patient with an elderly man who took 10 minutes deciding between pie flavors. But every few minutes, her eyes flicked toward the front windows, toward the parking lot, toward the road. The reflexive scan of someone checking exits, checking headlights, checking for a car that shouldn't be there. Nico had seen that look before. He'd seen it on men who'd skimmed money from the wrong people. He'd seen it once, on his own mother, in the last year of his father's life, when the old man's enemies had started circling close enough to smell blood. Ren Ashford was hiding from someone, and she was doing it alone. When her shift ended near midnight, Nico was still there, the only customer left, nursing a 4th cup of coffee he didn't want. She untied her apron behind the counter, and he watched her hesitate at the back door, watched her hand hover over the light switch, like she needed a moment to gather the nerve to walk out into the dark parking lot alone. It was such a small thing. A woman afraid of an empty parking lot. It happened everywhere, every night, and meant nothing most of the time. But Nico had not survived 15 years in his world by ignoring small things, and every instinct he had, the ones that had kept him alive through 2 attempts on his life and 1 on his father's, told him this fear was not ordinary. "I'll walk you to your car," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know you don't need it," Nico said, standing, buttoning his coat with unhurried hands. "I'm offering it anyway. There's a difference." Something flickered across her face. Not gratitude, not yet, but a kind of exhausted recognition, like she was too tired to keep fighting a battle that cost her nothing to lose. She let him walk her the 15 feet to a rusted-out sedan that had seen better decades, and it was there, in the orange wash of a single working parking lot light, that she finally looked at him directly for the first time all night. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You don't know me. You had dinner. That's it. That's all tonight was supposed to be." "You're right," Nico said. "That's all it was supposed to be." He didn't explain the rest. Didn't explain that he had learned, over a lifetime spent among liars, to recognize the exact texture of someone else's fear, or that something about the discipline in her crying had reminded him of the discipline he'd had to build in himself at 19 years old, the night his father had handed him a gun and told him that the marketing name did not have room in it for boys who flinched. He didn't say any of that. He simply held out a card, plain, cream-colored, nothing on it but a phone number, and said, "If someone comes for you, call this number before you call anyone else, not the police. Me." She didn't take it right away. She looked at the card the way a person looks at a bridge they're not sure will hold their weight. And Nico understood, with a clarity that unsettled him, that whatever had put that fear in her eyes was bad enough that she genuinely didn't know who was safe to trust anymore. A stranger in an expensive coat included. "You don't even know my name," she finally said. "Ren," he said, nodding toward the tag still pinned crookedly to her uniform. "It's a start." She took the card. He watched her get into her car, watched the engine catch on the third try, watched her tail lights disappear down the dark county road, before he let himself walk back to the SUV, where Sal was waiting with the patient, unreadable face of a man who had learned not to ask his boss questions. But Sal's silence had its limits. "You want me to run her?" Sal asked, once they were back on the highway. It wasn't really a question either. In Nico's world, an unexplained interest in a stranger was itself a kind of order. "Yeah," Nico said, watching the dark fields blur past the window, the diner's half-lit sign shrinking to nothing in the mirror. "Find out everything. Quietly. I don't want anyone knowing we're asking." It took Sal 4 days to come back with an answer, and when he did, he came back with almost nothing, which, in Nico's experience, was somehow worse than finding something. Ren Ashford, Waitress, 28 years old, had lived in that county for exactly 11 months. Before that, she didn't exist. No prior address that checked out, no employment history that led anywhere real. A social security number that was technically valid, but attached to a birth certificate that, when Sal's guy dug deep enough, had been issued for a baby who had died in a hospital in Ohio 30 years ago and never should have had a life attached to it since. "She's a ghost," Sal said, dropping the thin folder on Nico's desk in the study of the house he'd grown up in, the house that still smelled faintly of his father's cigars, even 4 years after the old man's funeral. "A good one. Somebody built her a whole new life. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." Nico opened the folder and looked at the one photograph Sal had managed to find, not of Ren the waitress, but buried 3 layers deep in a database that shouldn't have been searchable. A photograph of a different woman entirely, dark-haired instead of the ash blonde she wore now, dressed in the kind of severe blazer that belonged in a boardroom, standing beside a name that made something cold uncurl low in Nico's stomach. Elena Voss, forensic accountant, formerly employed by a firm that, 11 months ago, had been quietly retained to audit the books of the Castellano organization, the same Castellano organization that had spent the last 2 years trying to carve territory out of the edges of Nico's own. "She found something," Nico said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, the way it always did with the truths that mattered most. She found something in the Castellano books, and instead of burying it, she ran. Or she found something, and somebody helped her disappear before the Castellanos found out she'd seen it, Sal said. "Either way, that's not a woman who's hiding from an ex-boyfriend, boss. That's a woman who's hiding from people like us." Nico sat with that for a long moment, the photograph of Elena Voss, of Ren, before she was Ren, held loosely between 2 fingers. He thought of her hands, steady while she poured his coffee. He thought of the discipline in her crying, the same discipline he recognized because he'd had to build the same armor at 19, the same year he'd learned that survival in this world meant becoming someone your own family sometimes didn't recognize. He thought about how easy it would be to close this folder, forget the diner, forget the parking lot, forget the card he'd handed her like a fool, because a woman who had rattled the Castellanos badly enough to need a new identity was not a complication he needed, while his own territory was already under quiet siege from that same family. He didn't close the folder. "Find out what she saw," he said instead. "Find out exactly what's in those books that scared her enough to disappear. And find out who's still looking for her. Because somebody put that fear in her eyes 4 nights ago, and it wasn't a memory. It was current." He was right. It was current, and it had a name. Marcus Reed, a fixer the Castellano family used for exactly this kind of problem. A man whose entire professional value lay in finding people who did not want to be found, and making sure they never resurfaced to cause trouble again. He had been in that county for 6 weeks, working through it town by town, diner by diner, showing an old photograph of a dark-haired woman in a blazer to waitresses and gas station clerks and anyone else who might have crossed paths with a woman running from a very specific kind of debt. 3 nights before Nico walked into the Evergreen Diner, Reed had called the number Ren Still, foolishly, sentimentally, kept from her old life. A burner phone she'd promised herself she'd throw away, and never had, because it was the last thread connecting her to the sister she'd left behind. And he had told her, in a voice as calm and pleasant as a man discussing the weather, that he knew what town she was in. He didn't know the diner yet, but he would. And when he found her, there would be no new identity waiting on the other side, no quiet relocation, no second chance. That was the call she'd been crying about behind the kitchen door. That was the fear Nico had walked in on without knowing its shape. He learned all of this 2 weeks later, sitting across from Ren in a booth at a different diner, one he'd chosen this time, in a different county entirely, because by then she had finally, carefully, begun to trust him enough to answer his calls. It hadn't been easy getting her there. She had ignored the card for 11 days. She told him later that she'd almost thrown it away 4 separate times, that every instinct she had, instincts sharpened by 11 months of looking over her shoulder, told her that a man who traveled with armed men and paid for meatloaf in cash was not a man whose help came free. But on the 12th night, Marcus Reed's associate had been spotted asking questions at the gas station 2 miles from her apartment, and fear, in the end, had done what Nico's patience alone could not. She had called the number on the card at 11 p.m., her voice flat and controlled in a way that broke something quiet in Nico's chest, and said only, "I think someone found me." He'd had her moved within the hour, not to one of his own properties. He was careful about that, careful in a way that surprised even Sal, who had expected his boss to simply absorb her the way he absorbed everything else he decided he wanted. Instead, Nico put her in a quiet rental 2 counties over, under a fresh set of papers his own people built, better than whoever had built her last identity. And for 3 days he did not go near her himself, because some instinct told him that showing up too fast, too eager, would only confirm every fear she had about men who offered help with strings already tied. On the 4th day, she called him, not out of gratitude, out of anger. "You had someone follow Marcus Reed," she said, the moment he picked up. "You had someone watching him watch me. For how long?" "Since the night I met you," Nico admitted, because he had decided, somewhere in those 4 days, that lying to her would cost him more than the truth would. "I told my man to find out who you were, and who was looking for you. He did his job well. You investigated me. I protected you," he said. "The investigating was how I learned I needed to." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that he thought she might have hung up. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but stripped down to something rawer than the careful blankness she'd worn at the diner counter. Do you know what I did? Do you know why they're looking for me? I know you found something in the Castellano books, Nico said. I know you ran instead of burying it. I don't know what it was. I found a decade of laundered money moving through shell companies that didn't officially exist, she said, and now her voice was shaking. Not with fear, but with something closer to fury. 11 months of held-back rage, finally finding a crack to escape through. Money that funded things I can't even say out loud. And when I brought it to my managing partner, thinking he'd report it, thinking that was the whole point of the audit, he told me to bury it. He told me some clients you don't cross. And when I refused, when I said I was going to the FBI whether the firm backed me or not, he must have called the Castellanos himself, because 2 nights later, a man broke into my apartment and told me, very politely, that I had 1 week to decide whether I wanted to disappear on my own terms, or theirs. You still have it, Nico said slowly. The evidence. I have a copy, Ren said. Encrypted, hidden somewhere they will never think to look, because it's the last thing keeping me alive. The moment I hand it over, I lose the only leverage I have left, and the moment they find me without it, I'm just a loose end. Nico sat with the weight of that for a long moment, the phone pressed to his ear, the study around him gone very quiet. He understood exactly what she was holding, because he understood exactly what it was worth. Not just to the FBI, not just to whatever justice system might eventually want it, but to him. 10 years of Castellano money laundering, documented, verified, sitting in the hands of a woman he had, against every rule he'd built his life around, decided to protect. If that evidence became public, or worse, if it fell into the hands of a rival who knew how to use it, it wouldn't just destroy the Castellanos. It would blow open the fragile balance of power that had kept 3 families from open war for the better part of a decade. A balance the Marchetti organization, his organization, depended on as much as anyone. He could take it from her. The thought arrived, cold and clean, the way the most dangerous thoughts always did in his world, not as a temptation, but simply as an option, laid out flat and obvious, the kind of move his father would have made without hesitation. Take the evidence, use it himself, as leverage, as a weapon, as the single card that could end the Castellano threat to his territory forever. Ren Ashford would become, in that version of events, nothing more than a useful accident, a woman who happened to be carrying exactly what he needed at exactly the moment he needed it. He did not reach for that option, and the fact that he didn't, the fact that some part of him recoiled from the idea of using her the way everyone else in her life already had, told him something about himself that he was not entirely ready to sit with. I'm not going to ask you for it, he said instead. Everyone asks for it eventually, Ren said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a terrible, weary certainty. That's the only reason anyone's ever nice to me anymore. Then I'll be the first exception, Nico said. I don't want the evidence, Ren. I want you safe. Those are 2 different problems, and I intend to solve the second one whether or not you ever trust me with the first. She didn't believe him. Not that night, and not for a long while after. And Nico found, to his own quiet surprise, that he understood exactly why, and that her disbelief didn't frustrate him the way disrespect usually did. It settled into him instead, as something closer to respect. A woman who trusted too easily would not have survived 11 months alone against people like Marcus Reed. Her suspicion of him was not an insult. It was proof that she was exactly as sharp as he'd suspected from the first night, watching her hand stay steady while her voice stayed hidden behind a kitchen door. Over the following weeks, something began to shift between them that neither of them named out loud. He drove out to see her twice a week, always with Sal or another man waiting outside, always careful never to stay past midnight, as though there were rules to this that he was inventing as he went and enforcing on himself with the same discipline he brought to everything else. She started letting him in past the front hallway. She started making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1 when she heard his car in the driveway. She told him in careful, doled-out pieces about the sister she'd left behind in Pittsburgh, about the mother who thought Elena Voss had died in a car accident, because that was the story the people who'd built her new identity had decided was safest, about the strange, suffocating grief of being alive and unable to tell a single person who loved her that she still was. And he told her things too, things he had never said to anyone, not to the men who'd known him since he was a boy playing in his father's warehouse, not to the string of women before her who had wanted the version of him that came with money and danger and none of the weight underneath it. He told her about the night his father died, about the 20 minutes he'd spent alone in a hospital corridor, deciding whether to let himself feel anything before he had to walk out and become, in front of 100 watching men, the kind of leader who didn't. He told her that he had built himself deliberately, brick by brick, into someone who felt nothing where other people felt everything, because feeling nothing was the only way he'd ever found to keep the people he loved from becoming weapons his enemies could use against him. And he told her, on a night neither of them planned for, that meeting her had cracked something in that construction that he did not know how to repair, and was no longer entirely sure he wanted to. It should have stayed there. 2 guarded people, slowly, carefully, learning the shape of trust in a world built to punish it. If Marcus Reed hadn't found her again. He found her on a Tuesday, 3 months after the diner, through a mistake that was not Nico's fault, and not Wren's either, but the fault of a man neither of them had thought to suspect. Sal's own second cousin, a low-level runner in the Marchetti organization named Pete Colon, who had gambling debts to a Castellano-connected bookie, and had, under exactly the kind of pressure that made men betray families they'd sworn loyalty to, mentioned, just once, just in passing, not even understanding what he was handing over, that the boss had been driving out to a rental property 2 counties over more nights than made sense for a man with no reason to be there. That was all it took. Marcus Reed was patient and thorough, and it took him only 9 days to turn that single loose thread into a photograph of Wren Ashford stepping out onto her porch in the morning light, a photograph that landed on a Castellano capo's desk with a note that said, simply, "Found her." Nico learned about the betrayal the same night he learned about the photograph, both pieces of information arriving within an hour of each other, like a single blow delivered in 2 parts. He learned about Petey Colon from Sal, white-faced and shaking with a fury that came from shame as much as loyalty, because the leak had come from his own blood. And he learned about the photograph from a phone call that came in at 2 in the morning, not from Wren, but from Marcus Reed himself, calm and pleasant as ever, informing Nico Marchetti that the Castellano family had no interest in a war with the Marchettis over 1 runaway accountant, and that if Nico simply stepped aside and let them collect what belonged to them, this could all be resolved without anyone else needing to get hurt. "She doesn't belong to you," Nico said, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than Sal had ever heard it, the particular, terrible quiet of a man who had already decided something and was simply informing the world of the decision rather than asking permission for it. "And you are not walking away from this call thinking you've made yourself clear. I am." He hung up before Reed could answer, and for the first time in 4 years, since the night he'd buried his father and inherited a war he hadn't started, Nico Marchetti felt something he recognized, uneasily, as fear. Not for himself, but for a woman who had spent 11 months learning to survive alone, and was about to find out whether the one person she'd finally let close enough to matter could actually protect her, or whether she'd simply traded one kind of danger for another, wearing a better coat. He drove to her that night himself. No driver, no second car trailing behind, because speed mattered more than caution now, and some part of him needed to be the one who told her, needed to see her face, when she understood exactly how much danger she was in, and exactly how far he intended to go to end it. She opened the door before he'd finished knocking, already reading the truth in his face, the way she'd read every dangerous man's face for 11 months, and said, simply, "They found me." "Yes. How long do I have?" "That's not the question," Nico said, stepping inside, closing the door behind him with a care that felt almost gentle against the size of what he was about to say. "The question is whether you trust me enough to let me handle what happens next, or whether you're going to run again on your own, the way you've been running for a year, and hope you get lucky one more time." Ren looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, the discipline, the careful control she'd worn like armor, since the first night he'd watched her force it back into place at the diner counter, finally, visibly, cracked. "I don't want to run anymore," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, in a way it hadn't broken even that first night, behind the kitchen door. "I'm so tired of running, Nico. I don't have anything left to run with." "Then don't," he said. "Give me the evidence." She flinched back from him like he'd struck her, 11 months of hard-earned suspicion flooding back into her eyes all at once, and Nico understood, in that instant, exactly how badly he'd chosen his words. Understood that after weeks of promising he didn't want what everyone else had always wanted from her, the request had landed exactly like every betrayal that came before it. "I'm not asking you to hand it to me so I can use it," he said quickly, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping into something rawer than the cold control he usually wore like a second skin. "I'm asking because the only way to end this, really end it, not just push it back another month, another town, another new name, is to make sure that evidence is somewhere the Castellanos can never touch it and can never take from you by force. Somewhere it can be used against them the moment they make a single wrong move. I don't want to take it from you, Ren. I want to help you finally use it." It took her a long time to answer, long enough that Nico thought he might have lost, in one clumsy sentence, everything he'd spent 3 careful months building. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than he expected. Steadier than it had any right to be from a woman who'd just been told her hiding place had run out of road. "If I do this," she said, "if I finally use what I have, it doesn't just end quietly. It burns. It burns the Castellanos publicly. It drags federal attention into a world you've spent your whole life keeping in the dark. Are you sure that's a fire you want lit anywhere near your own house?" It was, Nico understood, the exact right question. The question that separated the man who wanted to use her from the man who wanted to save her. And he answered it the only way that would mean anything to a woman who had learned, the hard way, never to trust promises that cost the person making them nothing. "My house has secrets in it too," he said quietly. "Things my father did, things I've done, keeping his organization alive. If your fire reaches far enough, it might not stop at the Castellanos' door. I know that. I'm telling you to light it anyway." That was the night everything between them stopped being careful. What followed over the next 10 days was not a quiet unraveling, but a controlled detonation, orchestrated with the same precision Nico brought to every war he'd ever fought. Except this time, the objective wasn't territory or tribute. It was a woman's freedom, purchased with the one weapon powerful enough to buy it. Ren retrieved the encrypted files from the place she'd hidden them 11 months earlier, a safety deposit box registered under a name that belonged to neither Ren Ashford nor Elena Voss. And for 3 sleepless nights, she and a forensic contact Nico trusted absolutely, a woman named Dana Okafor, who owed the Marchetti organization a debt from years before and had never once been asked to repay it until now, worked to package a decade of laundered Castellano money into something no firm, no lawyer, no federal prosecutor could ignore or bury. Marcus Reed, unaware that his prey had stopped running and started building a weapon, made his move on the 11th night, arriving at Ren's rental with 2 men and the calm, professional confidence of someone who had done this exact job a dozen times before and expected tonight to look no different. What he found instead was Nico Marchetti standing in the doorway, alone, unarmed, in a house that Reed did not yet know was surrounded on all sides by men who had been waiting, patiently and silently, for 6 hours. "You should have taken the deal," Reed said, and for the first time in the whole quiet, terrible dance between them, something like uncertainty flickered across his professionally composed face. "You should have asked who you were actually dealing with before you put a photograph of her on someone's desk," Nico said. "The Castellanos think they're hunting a runaway accountant. They're not. They're about to find out they spent a year chasing the one person alive who can end them, and that the man standing between her and you has absolutely nothing left to lose by making sure that happens." The confrontation that followed was not the kind of violence Nico's world usually produced. No gunfire, no blood on a diner floor, none of the theater that might have made for an easier, simpler ending. It was quieter than that, and in its own way more devastating. Within 48 hours, copies of Ren's evidence reached 3 separate federal field offices. 2 investigative journalists Donna Okafor trusted from a previous life, and, with a precision that felt almost like poetry, the desks of 2 Castellano capos who had spent a decade believing their money was untouchable. Marcus Reed was arrested, attempting to cross a state line 4 days later, not for anything connected to Ren at all, but because the sudden collapse of Castellano protection left him exposed to 3 older federal warrants that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of opening. The Castellano organization did not fall in a single dramatic night. It fell the way empires actually fall, slowly, publicly, humiliatingly, indictment by indictment, asset seizure by asset seizure, until the family that had spent 2 years testing the edges of Marchetti territory no longer had the resources or the credibility to test anyone's edges at all. Nico's own organization was not left untouched by the fire Ren had lit. Some of what burned did reach close enough to singe him. An old associate of his father's, implicated in early transactions Ren's evidence happened to touch, was quietly, permanently removed from any position of influence. A piece of the past Nico had inherited without ever fully choosing it. Finally, painfully, cut away. It cost him something. He had known it would, but he had told her that first raw night that he was willing to let the fire reach his own house, and when it did, he did not flinch from the bill. Ren Ashford, she chose in the end to keep that name rather than reclaim the one she'd buried, because Elena Voss belonged to a woman who had trusted the wrong people and paid for it with a year of her life, and Ren was the name of the woman who had survived that year and come out the other side of it still herself. She testified, eventually, in a federal courtroom 300 miles from the diner where all of this began, and when it was finished, when the last question was answered, and the last document entered into evidence, and the weight she'd carried alone for a year was finally, fully set down. She walked out of that courthouse into late afternoon sunlight and found Nico Marchetti waiting on the steps, exactly where he'd told her he would be, dressed not in the dark, commanding coat she'd first seen him in, but in something plainer, something that made him look, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man rather than a warning. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "What happens now is up to you. I'm not going to pretend I don't want an answer. But I'm not going to make you give me one before you're ready either." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into a diner by accident and refused to walk back out of her life afterward, who had offered her protection without asking for the one thing everyone else had always wanted, who had told her, on the worst night of a very bad year, that he was willing to let her fire burn all the way to his own front door. And she reached for his hand, the way she had once, a long time ago, reached for a plain cream-colored card she wasn't sure she should trust. "Take me somewhere that isn't a diner," she said. "I think I'm ready to find out what an ordinary dinner with you actually looks like." He laughed, a real laugh, low and startled, the kind of sound Sal would later swear he'd never once heard his boss make in 15 years of loyal service, and took her hand, and for the first time since the night his father died, and left him a war disguised as an inheritance, Nico Marchetti walked toward something instead of away from it, toward a woman who had taught him, without ever meaning to, that the strongest people in any room are rarely the ones holding the guns. If you were captivated by Ren's hidden strength and Nico's dark, careful obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Ren's shoes? Trust the dangerous stranger, or run one more time? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.